Marcus Chen wiped the sweat from his brow as he carefully placed another delicate ornament into the storage box. The small workshop behind his cramped apartment on Kepler Station was filled with the soft glow of his latest creations. Each ornament was unique, hand-carved from salvaged materials he had collected over the past 3 years working as a maintenance technician on the Outer Rim trading post. The station orbited a gas giant in the Andromeda sector, serving as a crucial refueling point for ships traveling between the human colonies and the vast alien territories beyond. It was here that dozens of species mingled, traded, and sometimes clashed. For Marcus, it had become both home and prison. He picked up one of his newest pieces, a small crystal figurine shaped like a soaring bird. The crystal had once been part of a broken navigation array, but Marcus had seen something else in its fractured surface. Hours of careful work had transformed the discarded component into something beautiful. The way light danced through its translucent wings made it seem almost alive. Another useless trinket, Chen? The voice belonged to Vex Korath, a Zephyrian trader who frequently used the station's services. The tall, blue-skinned alien stood in the doorway of Marcus's workshop, his forearms crossed in what Marcus had learned was a gesture of disdain among his species. Marcus carefully set the crystal bird back in its place. "Just keeping my hands busy, Vex." "Busy making garbage." His large black eyes surveyed the collection of ornaments with obvious disgust. "I've told you before, human. Your time would be better spent learning a real trade. These decorations serve no purpose." The Zephyrian wasn't alone in his opinion. Most of the alien species that frequented Kepler Station viewed Marcus's hobby as pointless at best, offensive at worst. The Draknari considered the creation of non-functional objects to be a sign of mental deficiency. The crystalline Vorthak found the very concept of beauty for beauty's sake to be illogical. Even many of the human traders and workers on the station had grown tired of what they saw as Marcus's childish pastime. "Art isn't about purpose," Marcus said quietly, running his fingers along the smooth surface of a wooden sculpture. "It's about expression, about finding beauty in unexpected places." Vex's laugh was harsh and grating. "Expression? Beauty? These are concepts for species that have solved all their real problems. Humans are still struggling to establish themselves in this galaxy, and you waste time on this nonsense." Marcus had heard variations of this argument countless times. Humans were indeed the newest arrivals to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most alien species had been part of the galactic consortium for centuries or millennia. In their eyes, humans were barely more than curious primitives, tolerated for their usefulness as laborers and their willingness to take on dangerous jobs that other species avoided. "Maybe that's exactly why we need art," Marcus replied. "Maybe beauty is what makes the struggle worthwhile." Vex shook his head, causing the bioluminescent patches on his neck to flicker with annoyance. "Your species will never be taken seriously if you continue to indulge in such frivolity. The consortium values efficiency, logic, and strength, not these toys." After Vex left, Marcus continued his work in solitude. The criticism stung, but he had learned to push it aside. Creating these ornaments was the one thing that brought him peace in the often harsh environment of the Outer Rim. Each piece was a small rebellion against the utilitarian mindset that dominated life on the station. He had started the hobby 3 years ago, shortly after arriving on Kepler Station. A former art teacher from Earth, Marcus had taken the maintenance job out of necessity after his previous position on a research vessel had been eliminated due to budget cuts. The work was honest but monotonous, involving the repair and upkeep of the station's countless systems. In his spare time, he found himself drawn to the discarded materials that accumulated in the maintenance bays. Broken circuit boards, damaged hull plating, worn-out components that were destined for the recyclers. Something about the shapes and textures of these discarded pieces spoke to him. A twisted piece of conduit became the trunk of a tree. A cracked power coupling transformed into the petals of an exotic flower. Slowly, Marcus began to see potential in everything around him. His first attempts had been crude, but as his skills improved, so did the complexity and beauty of his creations. He taught himself to work with materials he had never encountered before. Crystalline substrates from Vorthak technology, biometals from Zephyrian ships, even rare elements that had no names in any human language. The station's administrator, a pragmatic woman named Director Sarah Walsh, had initially been supportive of Marcus's hobby. She saw it as good for morale and encouraged other workers to pursue creative outlets. However, as complaints from alien traders and diplomats began to pile up, her support had cooled considerably. "Chen, we need to talk." Director Walsh appeared in his workshop doorway, just as Marcus was putting the finishing touches on a new piece. This one was special, a complex arrangement of interwoven metals and crystals that seemed to shift and change as the viewer's perspective changed. He had been working on it for weeks, and he was particularly proud of the way the different materials complemented each other. "What can I do for you, Director?" Marcus asked, not looking up from his work. "I've been getting more complaints about your hobby. Ambassador Thekvar from the Draknari Trade Guild says your ornaments are a distraction during negotiations. Apparently, some of his subordinates keep staring at them instead of focusing on business." Marcus finally looked up. "Isn't that a good thing?" "Maybe they're starting to appreciate." "No, Marcus, it's not a good thing." Walsh's voice was firm. "The Draknari see it as a sign of weakness. They think humans are easily distracted by meaningless, pretty things. It undermines our credibility in trade negotiations." Marcus felt a familiar frustration building in his chest. "So because they can't appreciate art, I have to stop creating it?" "You can create whatever you want in your personal quarters," Walsh replied. "But I'm asking you to stop displaying them in public areas. And definitely don't bring them to any official functions or meetings. The Winter Festival is next week," Marcus said. "I've been preparing ornaments for the celebration. It's one of the few times when all the species on the station come together for something positive." Walsh sighed. "I know, and I appreciate your enthusiasm, but maybe this year you could contribute in a different way. Help with the logistics or the catering or—" "Those jobs are already covered," Marcus interrupted. "The ornaments are my contribution. They're how I participate in the community." The director studied his face for a long moment. Marcus could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to support her people, but she also had to maintain diplomatic relations with the dozens of alien species that used the station. "Look, Marcus," she said finally, "I understand this is important to you, but you have to understand my position too. One wrong move, one offended ambassador, and we could lose trade agreements that keep this station operational. Hundreds of jobs could be at stake." Marcus nodded slowly. He did understand, even if he didn't like it. Kepler Station existed in a delicate balance, dependent on the goodwill of species that saw humans as junior partners at best. Still, the thought of hiding his art away felt like admitting defeat. "What if I only displayed them in the human quarters?" he suggested. "Away from the main diplomatic areas?" Walsh considered this. "That might work, as long as you keep them out of sight during any official events." After she left, Marcus stared at his collection with new eyes. These pieces, which had brought him so much joy and satisfaction, were now seen as liabilities. He thought about packing them all away, hiding them in storage where they couldn't offend anyone. But something inside him rebelled against the idea. Instead, he picked up his tools and continued working on the piece he had been crafting. If this was going to be his last public display, he wanted it to be his best work yet. The Winter Festival was a tradition that had emerged organically on Kepler Station. Different species had their own seasonal celebrations, and over time these had merged into a single event that served as both cultural exchange and diplomatic gathering. It was one of the few times when the rigid hierarchies and territorial disputes that normally dominated station life were set aside in favor of shared celebration. Marcus spent the days leading up to the festival putting the finishing touches on his ornaments. He had created nearly 30 pieces specifically for the event, each one designed to represent different aspects of winter from various worlds. There were crystalline icicles that caught and refracted light in impossible ways, metallic snowflakes with fractal patterns that seemed to go on forever, and abstract representations of winter winds that seemed to move even when perfectly still. The centerpiece of his collection was the complex piece he had been working on when Director Walsh visited. He had decided to call it Convergence, a name that seemed fitting for both its artistic composition and the multicultural nature of the festival itself. On the morning of the festival, Marcus carefully transported his ornaments to the human residential section. The area had been decorated with traditional items from Earth, evergreen branches, colorful lights, and various symbols associated with winter celebrations. His ornaments fit naturally into this environment, adding an otherworldly beauty that complemented the familiar decorations. As the festival began, Marcus watched from a distance as beings from dozens of species moved through the station's corridors. The main celebration was taking place in the central hub, where diplomatic protocols were carefully maintained and cultural exchanges were managed with bureaucratic precision. But in the human quarters, something more organic was happening. A group of young Zephyrian traders, curious about human customs, had wandered into the decorated area. Marcus watched as they stopped in front of his display, their large black eyes reflecting the light from his crystal ornaments. One of them reached out tentatively, then pulled back when she noticed Marcus watching. "It's okay," he said, approaching the group. "You can touch them if you want." The young Zephyrian looked at her companions uncertainly. Among their species, casual interaction with artwork was considered inappropriate without the creator's explicit permission. "What are they for?" she asked in accented but clear galactic standard. "They're not for anything," Marcus replied. "They're just beautiful." The concept seemed to puzzle the aliens. In Zephyrian culture, every object had a specific function. Even their most elaborate ceremonial items served practical purposes in religious or social rituals. But why create something with no function? Another of the traders asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. It was one he had been asked many times, and he had never found a completely satisfactory answer. "Maybe beauty is a function," he said finally. "Maybe making something beautiful is worthwhile even if it doesn't solve a practical problem." The Zephyrians exchanged glances, communicating in the rapid gesture language they used among themselves. Marcus couldn't understand their signs, but he could see that they were intrigued rather than dismissive. One of them, a female with particularly vibrant bioluminescent patches, stepped closer to the display. She was studying the centerpiece, the complex arrangement Marcus had called convergence. As she moved around it, the different materials caught the light in various ways, creating an ever-changing pattern of reflections and shadows. "It moves," she said in wonder. "Not really," Marcus explained. "It just looks different from each angle. The way the materials interact changes depending on your perspective." "Like truth," the Zephyrian said quietly. Marcus blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected such a philosophical observation from someone who had seemed purely practical moments before. "What's your name?" he asked. "I am called Lyra in your language," she replied. "And you are the human who makes these impossible things, Marcus. And they're not impossible, just different." Lyra nodded slowly. "Different can be frightening to some, but also fascinating." As the day progressed, more beings found their way to the human quarters. Word had apparently spread about the unusual decorations, and despite the official discouragement, curiosity proved stronger than diplomatic caution. A group of Draknari juveniles spent nearly an hour examining Marcus's fractal snowflakes, their analytical minds apparently fascinated by the mathematical precision of the patterns. A delegation of elderly Vortex scholars engaged him in a lengthy discussion about the philosophical implications of creating objects without practical purpose, but it was the children who truly understood his work. Regardless of species, they seemed to grasp intuitively what the adults found so difficult to comprehend. A young human girl spent 20 minutes making up stories about the crystal bird, while a Draknari child traced the patterns on a metallic sculpture with obvious delight. As evening approached, the formal festival was winding down. Diplomatic gifts had been exchanged, trade agreements had been renewed, and various cultural presentations had been dutifully observed. But in the human quarters, something unexpected was happening. The informal gathering had grown throughout the day, drawing beings from across the station. What had started as curiosity about human customs had evolved into something approaching genuine cultural exchange. Representatives from species that rarely interacted outside of business contexts were sharing stories about their own artistic traditions. Marcus found himself at the center of conversations he had never imagined having. A Vorthak crystal singer explained how her people created music by growing specific crystal formations. A Draknari engineer described the mathematical beauty he found in perfectly designed mechanical systems. Even Vex Korath, the Zephyrian trader who had been so dismissive of Marcus's work, was engaged in an animated discussion about the role of aesthetics in ship design. "Perhaps," Vex was saying, "there is value in creating things that serve no purpose other than to please the senses. On Zephyr Prime, our oldest temples are covered in carvings that serve no structural function. We tell ourselves they are historical records or religious symbols, but truthfully, we maintain them because they are, what is the human word, beautiful." Marcus smiled. "Maybe that's what art really is. Permission to admit that beauty matters even when we can't explain why." As the celebration continued into the night, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, not just among his own species, but in this strange, diverse community that had formed around his simple ornaments. For the first time since arriving on Kepler Station, he felt like more than just a maintenance worker, filling a necessary but unremarkable role. He was an artist, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something after all. The evening was far from over, and Marcus had no idea that tomorrow would bring visitors who would change everything he thought he knew about his place in the galaxy. But for now, surrounded by beings from a dozen different worlds, all united in their appreciation for something beautiful and purposeless. He was content. The festival had become something more than anyone had planned, and at its heart were his ridiculed ornaments, no longer symbols of human frivolity, but bridges between worlds and minds that had never truly met before. The morning after the winter festival brought an unusual quiet to Kepler Station. Marcus had stayed late cleaning up the human quarters, carefully packing away his ornaments while replaying the evening's conversations in his mind. For the first time in years, he had fallen asleep with a genuine smile on his face. That smile faded quickly when he arrived at his maintenance shift to find Director Walsh waiting for him, her expression grim. "We have a problem, Marcus," she said without preamble. "A big one." Marcus's heart sank. He had known the impromptu gathering would have consequences, but seeing Walsh's expression made him realize he had underestimated just how serious those consequences might be. "Several ambassadors filed formal complaints about yesterday's event," Walsh continued. "They claim it was an unauthorized cultural demonstration that violated established protocols. Ambassador Thekvar is particularly upset. He says his junior staff members are now questioning established Draknari positions on human capabilities." "Isn't that a good thing?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not when it undermines carefully negotiated trade relationships," Walsh replied. "The Draknari have very specific expectations about how humans should behave in diplomatic contexts. When those expectations are challenged, they don't react well." Marcus leaned against his workbench, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, nothing. Keep a low profile, do your job, and don't display any more ornaments in public areas. I'm trying to contain the diplomatic fallout, but it's going to take time." As Walsh left, Marcus tried to focus on his work, but concentration proved impossible. The maintenance tasks that had once provided mindless routine now felt hollow and meaningless. The brief taste of connection and understanding from the previous night made his isolation feel even more acute. He was recalibrating a water recycling unit in Section C when the station's proximity alarms began sounding. The deep, rhythmic tones indicated the approach of an unscheduled vessel, which usually meant either pirates or diplomatic emergencies. Given the current tension, Marcus hoped for pirates. The all-clear signal came 30 minutes later, followed by an announcement that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Attention Kepler Station personnel. We have been honored with an unexpected visit from Her Imperial Highness Zarathul, Crown Princess of the Draknari Empire. All non-essential personnel are to remain in designated areas until further notice. Diplomatic protocols are now in full effect." Marcus had never seen a Draknari princess, but he knew enough about their culture to understand the implications. The Draknari Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the Galactic Consortium, controlling dozens of star systems and commanding fleets that could reduce planets to ash. Their royal family rarely traveled, and when they did, it was usually for matters of extreme importance. The fact that Princess Zarathul had arrived unannounced suggested either a crisis or an opportunity of enormous magnitude. Either way, it meant that every aspect of station operations would be under intense scrutiny. Marcus spent the rest of his shift in the maintenance tunnels, trying to stay as invisible as possible. The last thing the station needed was for the princess to encounter the human whose ornaments had allegedly corrupted young Draknari minds. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. He was emerging from a particularly cramped access tunnel when he heard voices in the corridor ahead. One was Director Walsh, speaking in the carefully modulated tones reserved for high-level diplomatic encounters. The other was unlike any voice Marcus had ever heard. Melodic yet powerful, with an underlying resonance that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "I appreciate your concern for protocol, Director Walsh," the unfamiliar voice was saying. "But I am not here in an official capacity. This is what you humans would call a personal visit." Marcus froze. He was trapped in the maintenance tunnel with no way to retreat without making noise. His only option was to wait, and hope the conversation would move elsewhere. "Of course, Your Highness," Walsh was replying. "However, given the unusual circumstances of your arrival, I feel obligated to ensure that your experience here reflects the best of what Kepler Station has to offer." "Ah, yes. I have heard about these unusual circumstances. Something about decorative objects causing quite a stir among my people." Marcus closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear entirely. Of all the conversations to overhear, this was definitely the worst possible option. "There was a minor cultural misunderstanding during our winter festival," Walsh said carefully. "Nothing that can't be resolved through proper diplomatic channels." "I see." There was amusement in the princess's voice, which Marcus found more terrifying than anger would have been. "And where are these controversial ornaments now?" I confess I am curious to see what could inspire such passionate responses from my usually stoic subjects. They have been removed from public areas, Your Highness. I'm sure we can arrange a private viewing if you're interested, though I should mention that they are quite unconventional by Draknari standards. Director Walsh, I have spent my entire life surrounded by Draknari standards. Perhaps a little unconventionality is exactly what I need. Marcus heard footsteps moving away and allowed himself to breathe again, but his relief was short-lived when he realized the voices were heading in the direction of the human quarters and his carefully stored ornaments. He had two choices: remain hidden and hope for the best, or try to intercept them and attempt some form of damage control. Neither option seemed particularly appealing, but hiding felt too much like cowardice. Marcus emerged from the maintenance tunnel and hurried through the station's corridors, taking service routes to avoid the diplomatic entourage that he assumed would be accompanying the princess. He reached the human quarters just as Walsh was keying in the access code. "Director," he called out, slightly out of breath. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Walsh turned, and Marcus could see the mix of panic and resignation in her eyes. Standing beside her was the most striking being he had ever encountered. Princess Zarathal was tall even by Draknari standards, her scaled skin shifting between deep emerald and gold in the corridor lighting. Her eyes were large and multifaceted, like cut gemstones, and seemed to take in every detail of his appearance in a single glance. What made her truly magnificent, however, were the wing membranes that extended from her shoulders to her wrists, gossamer thin tissue that caught and reflected light in constantly changing patterns. "Your Highness," Walsh said quickly, "this is Marcus Chen, our senior maintenance technician." Marcus, Her Imperial Highness Princess Zarathal. Marcus had no idea what the proper protocol was for greeting Draknari royalty. He settled for a respectful bow, hoping it would suffice. "So you are the artist," the princess said, and Marcus was surprised to hear warmth rather than condemnation in her voice. "I'm a maintenance worker," he replied carefully. "The art is just a hobby." The princess tilted her head, studying him with obvious curiosity. "In my experience, humans rarely pursue activities without purpose. What purpose does your hobby serve?" It was the same question he had been asked countless times, but coming from her, it felt different. Less accusatory, more genuinely curious. "I'm not sure it serves any purpose," Marcus admitted. "It just feels necessary. Like breathing or sleeping. Something I need to do to remain myself." The princess's wing membranes shifted, creating new patterns in the light. Marcus had read enough about Draknari body language to know this indicated interest or approval. "May I see these controversial creations?" she asked. Walsh led them into the human quarters where Marcus's ornaments were still packed in storage containers. He began unpacking them carefully, arranging them on the tables where they had been displayed the night before. Princess Zarathal moved through the display slowly, examining each piece with the same careful attention Marcus had seen from the young Draknari visitors. But where they had seemed puzzled by the concept of purposeless beauty, she appeared to understand it intuitively. She paused at the crystal bird, the piece Marcus had been working on when Vex first criticized his hobby. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. "The way the light moves through the crystal, it's almost alive." "That was the intention," Marcus replied. "I wanted to capture the essence of flight without the mechanics of it. You have succeeded." She moved on to the next piece, a spiraling arrangement of metals that seemed to twist upward toward infinity. "And this, I call it aspiration. It's made from salvaged hull plating from 7 different ships. Each metal has different properties, but when they're combined like this, they become something greater than their individual components," the princess finished. "Yes, I see it. Fascinating." She continued through the display, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that demonstrated a deeper understanding of artistic principles than Marcus had expected from any Draknari, let alone a member of the imperial family. Finally, she reached the centerpiece, the complex arrangement Marcus had called convergence. She stood before it for a long time, moving around it to see it from different angles, her wing membranes shifting and changing as she examined the piece. "This one is different," she said eventually. "It's the most complex piece I've ever attempted," Marcus explained. "The idea was to create something that changes depending on how you look at it. No two viewpoints show exactly the same composition." "Like truth," she said, echoing the words Lyra had spoken the night before. "That's what someone said yesterday." "I hadn't thought of it that way, but I suppose it fits." The princess reached toward the ornament, then stopped. "May I?" Marcus nodded, surprised by her courtesy. Most beings who handled his work did so without asking permission. Princess Zarathal lifted the ornament carefully, holding it up to catch the light from different angles. As she turned it, her wing membranes began to shift in patterns that matched the changing reflections from the piece. "Extraordinary," she breathed. "It's as if the ornament is teaching my wings to dance." Marcus stared in amazement. He had never seen anything like the display the princess's wings were creating. Complex, shifting patterns that seemed to respond to and enhance the ornament's changing appearance. "Your wings," he began, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate to comment. "Draknari wings are more than mere appendages," she explained, still moving the ornament to create new light patterns. "They are extensions of our emotional and aesthetic sensibilities. When we encounter something truly beautiful, our wings respond automatically, creating visual harmonies that complement what we're experiencing." "I've never seen a Draknari do that before," Marcus admitted. The princess's expression grew somewhat sad. "Most of my people have forgotten this aspect of our nature. We have become so focused on efficiency and logic that we rarely encounter anything worthy of such a response. When we do, we often suppress it as inappropriate or undignified." She carefully set the ornament back in its place, but her wings continued their slow, hypnotic dance. "Your Highness," Walsh interjected carefully, "if I may ask, what brings you to Kepler Station?" Princess Zarathal's attention shifted from the ornaments to the two humans. "I received some rather concerned reports from our trade representatives about unusual activities during your winter festival. Specifically, reports that human-made decorative objects were having unexpected effects on our younger citizens." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry if my work caused any diplomatic problems. That was never my intention." "On the contrary," the princess replied, "I find these reports quite encouraging." "Do you know what my young subjects said when they returned from your festival?" Marcus shook his head. They asked questions. For the first time in their lives, they questioned the assumption that beauty without purpose is meaningless. They wondered why our own artistic traditions have become so rigid and formal. They suggested that perhaps there are ways of understanding the universe that don't fit neatly into our established categories. She turned back to the display, her wings still moving in those mesmerizing patterns. "This is exactly what our culture needs," she continued. "A reminder that there are perspectives beyond our own, ways of seeing that we have forgotten or never discovered. Your ornaments aren't just decorative objects, they're invitations to think differently." Walsh looked as stunned as Marcus felt. "Your Highness, I don't understand. Are you saying the complaints were unfounded?" "The complaints were quite founded," the princess replied, with what might have been amusement. "My trade representatives are genuinely concerned that exposure to human artistic sensibilities might undermine our commitment to pure pragmatism. They are absolutely correct to be worried." She moved closer to Marcus, her multifaceted eyes fixed on his face. "I have a proposition for you, Marcus Chen. I would like to commission you to create a piece specifically for the Imperial Palace, something that embodies this concept of purposeless beauty, but on a scale worthy of the throne room itself." Marcus's mind reeled. "Your Highness, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I understand. You want me to create art for the Draknari Empire?" "I want you to create a bridge between our cultures," she replied. "Something that will force my people to confront their assumptions about what has value and what doesn't. Something that will make them question whether efficiency and logic are the only worthwhile pursuits." "The trade representatives won't approve," Walsh said quietly. "This could create significant diplomatic complications." Princess Zariatal's laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Director Walsh, I am the crown princess of the Draknari Empire. When I assume the throne, I will need advisors who can think beyond the narrow confines of traditional policy. The trade representatives who are so concerned about human influence might find themselves reconsidering their positions." She turned back to Marcus. "What do you say? Will you accept my commission?" Marcus looked at the ornaments surrounding them, then at Walsh's anxious expression, and finally at the princess herself. Her wings had settled into a pattern that somehow conveyed both anticipation and respect. "I accept," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Princess Zarathal's wings shifted into what Marcus was beginning to recognize as a pattern of satisfaction. "Excellent. I will make arrangements for you to visit the Imperial Palace on Draknar Prime. You will have access to materials and tools beyond anything available on this station, and all the time you need to create something truly magnificent." As the implications of what he had just agreed to began to sink in, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was about to leave the safety of Kepler Station, for the heart of the Draknari Empire, to create art for beings who had spent centuries dismissing such pursuits as worthless frivolity. But looking at the princess's wings, still dancing their slow, hypnotic patterns in response to his humble ornaments, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was about to discover that his ridiculed hobby had a purpose after all. The purpose wasn't to create beautiful objects for their own sake, it was to create bridges between minds that had never truly understood each other, to find common ground in the most unexpected places, and to prove that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with the smallest, most seemingly insignificant acts of creation. Tomorrow would bring preparations for a journey that would change his life forever. But tonight, surrounded by his ornaments and watched by a dragon princess whose wings danced in appreciation of his work, Marcus Chen finally understood that he had never been just a maintenance worker with a hobby. He had always been an artist. The galaxy was only just beginning to figure out what that meant. Draknar Prime hung before the viewport like a jewel carved from emerald and gold. Marcus had thought he was prepared for his first sight of the Draknari homeworld, but nothing could have readied him for the reality of it. The planet's surface was covered in crystalline structures that caught and reflected the light of its twin suns, creating a constantly shifting display of colors that defied description. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Princess Zarathol said, joining him at the observation deck of her personal transport. "The crystal formations are natural, grown over millions of years from our planet's unique mineral composition. Our ancestors built their cities to complement these formations rather than replace them." Marcus could only nod. After 2 weeks of travel through hyperspace, during which he had worked closely with the princess to develop concepts for his commission, he had grown somewhat comfortable with her presence. But seeing her homeworld drove home the reality of what he was attempting to do. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, apparently reading his expression. "Third and fourth thoughts," Marcus admitted. "I keep wondering what I'm doing here. A few weeks ago, I was a maintenance worker whose hobby annoyed the neighbors. Now I'm supposed to create something meaningful for one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy." "Perhaps that's exactly why you're the right person for this task," the princess replied. "Someone who has spent their career maintaining the infrastructure of civilization understands its foundations in ways that those of us born to privilege cannot. And someone whose art has been dismissed and ridiculed understands the courage required to create something truly different." As their transport descended through Draknar Prime's atmosphere, Marcus got his first close look at a Draknari city. The settlement stretched for hundreds of kilometers, its buildings seeming to grow organically from the crystal formations around them. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen, flowing, organic shapes that appeared to have been grown rather than constructed. "How do you build structures like that?" Marcus asked, pressing his face to the viewport. "We don't build them in the traditional sense," Princess Zarathal explained. "We grow them using a combination of crystal manipulation techniques and bioarchitectural organisms. It's a process that takes decades, but the results integrate perfectly with our planet's natural systems." The transport landed in what appeared to be a garden, though the plants were unlike anything from Marcus's experience. Crystalline trees reached toward the sky with branches that chimed softly in the breeze, while flowers that seemed to be made of living light swayed among more conventional organic vegetation. "The Imperial Palace Gardens," the princess said as they disembarked. "I thought you might appreciate seeing how we blend the functional with the aesthetic." Marcus was overwhelmed by the sensory experience. Every surface seemed to catch and play with light in different ways, creating an environment that felt more like being inside a kaleidoscope than walking through a garden. The air itself seemed to shimmer with particles that created tiny rainbows as they moved. "This is where you'll be working," Princess Zarathul said, leading him to a circular clearing surrounded by the crystal trees. "I had this space prepared specifically for your project. The natural resonance of the crystal should enhance whatever you create, and the acoustics are perfect for contemplation." In the center of the clearing stood a workshop that looked like it had been grown from the same materials as the palace buildings. Inside, Marcus found tools and materials that represented the pinnacle of Draknari craftsmanship, along with samples of substances from dozens of worlds. "I don't know where to begin," Marcus said, running his hands over instruments whose purposes he could only guess at. "Perhaps you don't need to begin with the commission," the princess suggested. "Why don't you spend some time exploring the palace and the city? Understanding our culture might help you determine what kind of bridge you want to build between our peoples." Over the following days, Marcus immersed himself in Draknari society. What he discovered challenged many of his assumptions about their culture. While it was true that their public discourse emphasized efficiency and logic, their private lives were far more complex. In the lower levels of the palace, he found chambers filled with ancient artwork, sculptures and murals that celebrated beauty for its own sake. When he asked about them, the palace curator, an elderly Draknari named Kethrel, explained that they were remnants of an earlier era. Before the Great Consolidation 5 centuries ago, Kethrel said, his wing membranes shifting into patterns, Marcus was learning to interpret as nostalgia. Our people valued artistic expression as highly as scientific achievement. These works were created during what we now call the Age of Flowering. What happened to change that? Marcus asked, studying a mural that depicted Draknari figures with wings spread in elaborate displays of color and pattern. War, Kethrel replied simply. A series of conflicts with neighboring species nearly destroyed our civilization. We survived by focusing entirely on military and technological development. Art was seen as a luxury we couldn't afford. But the war is over now, isn't it? For 3 centuries, the curator confirmed. But habits of thought, once established, are difficult to change. We told ourselves that artistic pursuits were frivolous, and eventually we began to believe it. Marcus spent hours in those forgotten chambers, studying works that revealed a side of Draknari culture that had been suppressed but never completely eliminated. The wing patterns displayed in the ancient murals were far more complex and expressive than anything he had seen from contemporary Draknari. It was as if an entire dimension of their emotional and aesthetic expression had been deliberately constrained. You're beginning to understand, Princess Zarathol said when he shared his observations with her. My people have been living as half versions of themselves for centuries. They've forgotten that there was ever anything more. Why haven't you tried to change that? Marcus asked. I have in small ways, but change imposed from above creates resentment rather than genuine transformation. What we need is something that will inspire them to rediscover what they've lost on their own. As Marcus explored the palace and surrounding city, he began to see evidence of this constrained artistic impulse everywhere. Gardens were laid out with mathematical precision that created unintended beauty. Architecture followed purely functional principles that nonetheless achieved aesthetic perfection. Even the most mundane objects showed signs of an unconscious drive toward elegance that their creators would probably deny. The Draknari had not eliminated their aesthetic sense. They had simply forbidden themselves from acknowledging it. This realization began to shape Marcus's approach to the commission. Instead of creating something obviously artistic, he decided to design something that would appear functional while secretly serving no purpose other than beauty. A piece that would allow the Draknari to appreciate art while maintaining the pretense that they were admiring engineering. He began with the materials themselves. Draknari crystals grew in specific geometric patterns based on the frequency of sounds used during their cultivation. By carefully modulating these frequencies, Marcus discovered he could create crystals with internal structures that were both mathematically perfect and visually stunning. The bioarchitectural organisms responded to different chemical signals, growing into shapes that could appear either organic or geometric depending on the viewer's perspective. Marcus spent days learning to guide their growth, creating forms that shifted between seeming random and obviously designed. But the breakthrough came when he realized that he needed to incorporate motion into the piece. Draknari wing displays were fundamentally about movement and change. Static art, no matter how beautiful, wouldn't trigger the same response. Working with palace engineers who thought he was designing a new type of environmental control system, Marcus created a structure that used air currents and magnetic fields to keep elements in constant, subtle motion. To the engineers, it appeared to be a sophisticated atmospheric management device. In reality, it was designed to create ever-changing patterns of light and shadow that would resonate with suppressed Draknari aesthetic instincts. The piece took shape over several weeks. The central element was a crystalline spire that reached toward the throne room's ceiling, its surface covered with faceted elements that caught and redirected light in complex patterns. Around the base, bioarchitectural forms curved and twisted in shapes that suggested both natural growth and deliberate design. But the true masterpiece was the movement. Invisible air currents kept the smaller elements in constant motion, while magnetic fields caused metallic components to shift and realign in patterns that never repeated. The entire structure was designed to be different every time someone looked at it, while maintaining an underlying harmony that suggested deep mathematical principles at work. What do you call it? Princess Zarathul asked as they stood before the completed piece in the empty throne room. Synthesis, Marcus replied. It represents the marriage of logic and beauty, function and aesthetics. At least, that's what I'll tell the court engineers. To me, it's simply a reminder that beauty exists everywhere, even in places where we've been taught not to look for it. The princess's wings began their familiar dance, creating patterns that complemented the shifting light from the sculpture. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "It gives them permission to feel what they've been denying for centuries." The formal presentation was scheduled for the following day. Representatives from across the Draknari Empire would gather in the throne room to observe the installation of what had been described in official communications as an advanced atmospheric harmony system designed by human engineering specialist Marcus Chen. Marcus spent the night in his workshop, making final adjustments and trying to calm his nerves. Everything he had learned about art, about beauty, about the power of creation to bridge differences between peoples would be put to the test in a few hours. Princess Zarathol found him there as dawn broke over the crystal gardens. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," Marcus admitted. "What if they don't respond the way you expect? What if they see right through the pretense and dismiss it as frivolous decoration? Then we will have learned something important about how deeply they have buried their aesthetic instincts," she replied. "But I don't think that will happen. I've been watching the palace staff who helped with the installation. Their wings have been displaying patterns I haven't seen in years." As they walked toward the throne room together, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a maintenance worker whose hobby was seen as an embarrassing weakness. Today, he was about to unveil a work of art in the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. But more than that, he was about to test a theory that had been forming in his mind throughout his stay on Draknar Prime. The theory that art wasn't a luxury or a frivolity, but a fundamental need, as essential to civilization as technology or governance. The theory that cultures that suppressed their aesthetic instincts were cutting themselves off from a vital source of innovation and understanding. The theory that beauty, even when disguised as something else, had the power to heal divisions that politics and diplomacy could never bridge. The throne room was already filled with representatives from across the empire when they arrived. Marcus recognized some of the faces from briefings Princess Zarathul had given him. Military leaders, trade representatives, scientific advisors, and members of the extended royal family. All of them were staring at his sculpture with expressions he couldn't read. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Princess Zarathul announced, "I present the atmospheric harmony system designed by our human ally Marcus Chen. As you can see, it represents a significant advancement in environmental control technology, while also serving as a symbol of the cooperation between our species." Marcus held his breath as the assembled Draknari moved closer to examine the piece. Their reactions were subtle at first, a slight shift in wing position here, a change in posture there. But gradually, he began to see the signs he had hoped for. One by one, their wings began to respond. Not with the dramatic displays he had seen from Princess Zarathul, but with smaller, more tentative movements. Colors began to shift across their wing membranes, creating patterns that echoed and complemented the light show from his sculpture. An elderly military commander approached the base of the structure, his scarred wings beginning to unfurl in ways that Marcus suspected they hadn't moved in decades. A young scientific advisor stood transfixed by the interplay between the organic and crystalline elements, her wings creating rapid, excited patterns. But it was the reaction of the trade representatives that truly confirmed Marcus's success. These were the beings who had complained most vehemently about the corrupting influence of human artistic sensibilities. Now they stood before his disguised artwork with wings displaying patterns of wonder and appreciation that they probably didn't even realize they were creating. "Fascinating," one of them was saying to a colleague. "The efficiency of the atmospheric distribution is remarkable, but look at the elegant mathematical relationships in the structural design. It's almost as if function and beauty are not mutually exclusive concepts," Princess Zarathol finished quietly, moving to stand beside Marcus. The presentation continued for over an hour, with various officials asking technical questions that Marcus answered by describing the genuine engineering principles underlying his artistic choices. But throughout the discussion, he watched their wings, seeing in their unconscious patterns a hunger for beauty that centuries of cultural suppression had never quite managed to eliminate. As the gathering concluded and the officials began to file out, Marcus noticed that many of them were moving differently than when they had arrived. Their postures were more relaxed, their wing positions more expressive. It was as if the simple act of allowing themselves to appreciate something beautiful, even under the pretense of admiring engineering, had awakened aspects of their nature they had forgotten they possessed. "Well," Princess Zarathul said as the last of the representatives departed, "I think we can call that a success." Marcus looked at his sculpture, watching the endless play of light and shadow across its surfaces. and realized that he had created something far more significant than he had originally intended. He had not just built a bridge between human and Draknari aesthetics. He had helped an entire culture begin to rediscover a part of itself that it had lost. But as he would soon learn, the real test of his work was yet to come. Within days, the effects of synthesis would ripple outward from the throne room to touch the lives of beings across the empire, and the true measure of art's power to transform civilization would become apparent. The Dragon Princess had been right about one thing. Revolutions did indeed begin with the smallest, most seemingly insignificant acts of creation. Marcus was about to discover just how far-reaching those revolutions could be. 6 months had passed since the installation of synthesis in the Draknari throne room, and Marcus could barely recognize the empire he had first encountered. What had begun as a single piece of disguised artwork had sparked a transformation that no one, not even Princess Zarathol, had fully anticipated. The changes started small. Within weeks of the installation, reports began filtering in from across the empire of unusual behaviors among the Draknari population. Engineers were spending extra time on aesthetic details in their designs. Scientists were describing their discoveries in language that emphasized wonder as much as functionality. Even military personnel were requesting modifications to their equipment that served no purpose other than visual appeal. Marcus first witnessed the scope of the transformation during a tour of the capital city's manufacturing district. What had once been a purely utilitarian industrial complex was now filled with structures that managed to be both highly efficient and surprisingly beautiful. When he asked one of the facility supervisors about the changes, the Draknari's wings shifted into patterns Marcus had learned to recognize as embarrassment mixed with pride. The workers began making small modifications, the supervisor explained. Nothing that affected functionality, they insisted. Just improvements to the visual harmony of the workspace. Productivity has actually increased by 15% since the modifications began. And management approves of these changes? The supervisor's wings rippled with what Marcus now knew was amusement. Management would have a difficult time objecting to modifications that increase both efficiency and worker satisfaction.
Though I suspect some of them are struggling to understand why they find the new design so appealing. Similar transformations were occurring throughout Draknari society.
Artists who had worked in secret for generations were beginning to display their creations publicly, describing them as applied research in aesthetic engineering or studies in visual efficiency optimization. The pretense was thin, but it allowed both creators and viewers to appreciate beauty without admitting they were engaging in something their culture had long considered frivolous. Princess Zarathul had become something of a cultural revolutionary. Though she maintained the fiction that she was simply promoting integrated design principles and comprehensive environmental harmony. Her speeches to the Imperial Council were masterpieces of diplomatic language that managed to advocate for artistic expression without ever using the word art. The Human Consultant's atmospheric harmony system has demonstrated the value of considering aesthetic factors in functional design, she told the council during one session. Marcus observed. I propose that we establish formal protocols for incorporating similar principles into all Imperial projects. The council members, their wings betraying their enthusiasm even as their words remained carefully neutral, approved the proposal unanimously. Within months, every major construction project in the Empire included aesthetic consultants, a job title that didn't exist a year earlier and that everyone understood was a polite way of saying artist. But the most profound changes were occurring among the younger generation of Draknari. Those who had been exposed to Marcus's original ornaments during the Winter Festival on Kepler Station had become unofficial ambassadors for the new aesthetic sensibilities. They returned to their home worlds carrying small decorative items they had crafted themselves, describing them as studies in applied beauty theory or experiments in non-functional design optimization. Marcus encountered one of these young revolutionaries during a visit to Dr. Greyshaw Prime's premier educational institution. Lyra, the Zephyrian trader who had first understood the significance of convergence, had become something of a celebrity among the students, lecturing on interspecies aesthetic communication and the cultural applications of purposeless beauty. The human artist showed us something we had forgotten, she told a gathering of young Draknari scholars, her bioluminescent patches flickering with enthusiasm. He demonstrated that beauty is not the enemy of function, but its partner. That the impulse to create something meaningful, even if that meaning cannot be quantified or measured, is fundamental to intelligent life. Watching the student's wings respond to her words, Marcus realized that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time, different species were beginning to find common ground, not through trade agreements or military alliances, but through shared appreciation for the aesthetic dimension of existence. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Draknari Empire. Other species, observing the cultural renaissance taking place among their powerful neighbors, began re-evaluating their own relationships with art and beauty. The crystalline Vorthak, who had always dismissed aesthetic considerations as illogical, started incorporating harmony optimization into their architectural projects. The Zephyrians began acknowledging that their own traditional crafts served purposes beyond mere functionality. Even humanity began to see itself differently. Marcus's transformation from ridiculed hobbyist to cultural catalyst became a symbol of his species' unique contribution to galactic civilization. Human artists, who had often felt overshadowed by the technological achievements of older species, found themselves in unprecedented demand as consultants and collaborators. The political implications were enormous. Trade relationships that had been purely transactional began to include cultural exchange components. Diplomatic agreements started incorporating provisions for artistic collaboration. The Galactic Consortium, which had operated for millennia on principles of logical negotiation and economic efficiency, found itself grappling with the idea that aesthetic considerations might be as important as practical ones. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the various species viewed each other. The artificial barriers between practical and impractical cultures began to break down, as beings realized that everyone possessed aesthetic instincts, even if they had been suppressed or redirected. Marcus witnessed this transformation firsthand during a gathering at the newly established Institute for Interspecies Aesthetic Studies on Kepler Station. Representatives from dozens of civilizations had come together to share their artistic traditions and explore collaborative projects. It was a far cry from the utilitarian trading post he had first encountered years earlier. "Look around you," Princess Zarathul said, joining him at an observation window overlooking the Institute's main hall. "This is what you accomplished with your ridiculed ornaments." Below them, beings from across the galaxy were engaged in activities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Draknari engineers were collaborating with human artists on sculptures that incorporated both mathematical precision and emotional resonance. Vorthak crystal singers were teaching Zephyrian craftsmen how to create instruments that produced both sound and light. Even the famously pragmatic Korath were displaying decorative elements in their trade booth, describing them as cultural efficiency enhancers. "I didn't do this," Marcus replied. "I just made some ornaments that people happened to notice." "You created permission," the princess corrected him. Permission for billions of beings to acknowledge that beauty matters, that art has value, that the impulse to create something meaningful is not a weakness to be overcome but a strength to be celebrated. As if to emphasize her point, her wings began their familiar dance, creating patterns that were echoed and answered by other Draknari throughout the hall. But now Marcus could see that similar responses were occurring among other species as well. Bioluminescent displays from the Zephyrians, harmonic resonances from the Vorthak, even subtle color shifts in the biomechanical components of the Korath. The gathering was becoming an improvised celebration of interspecies artistic communication, and Marcus realized he was witnessing something that had never existed before in galactic history. A truly universal language, based not on words or mathematics, but on shared aesthetic experience. Over the following days, the Institute became the site of breakthrough after breakthrough in interspecies cooperation. Military leaders who had spent decades negotiating tense ceasefires found themselves collaborating on projects that combined their tactical expertise with artistic vision. Scientists who had approached research from purely empirical perspectives began incorporating aesthetic considerations into their methodologies, discovering that beauty could be a guide to truth as well as an end in itself. But the most moving moment came when Marcus encountered Ambassador Thikvar, the Draknari trade representative who had initially complained most vehemently about his ornaments' corrupting influence on young minds. "Human," the ambassador said, approaching Marcus with his wings held in a formal pattern of respect. "I owe you an apology." "That's not necessary," Marcus replied. "You were protecting your people's interests as you understood them." "I was protecting my people from growth," Thikvar corrected him. "From the possibility of becoming more than we had allowed ourselves to be. You showed us that there are forms of strength we had never recognized, ways of understanding the universe that our philosophy had dismissed as weakness." The ambassador's wings shifted into patterns Marcus had never seen before. Complex, flowing displays that seemed to tell a story of transformation and discovery. "My daughter has begun creating what she calls functional beauty studies," Thakvar continued. Objects that serve no purpose other than to make people happy when they look at them. I confess that I find them moving in ways I do not entirely understand. That's what art does, Marcus said gently. It helps us understand things we didn't know we needed to understand. As the gathering at the Institute continued, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 years ago, he had been a lonely maintenance worker whose hobby was seen as an embarrassment. Now he was at the center of a cultural revolution that was reshaping galactic civilization. But the most important realization came when he understood that his own transformation was just as significant as the changes he had helped bring about in others. He was no longer the person who had quietly crafted ornaments in a cramped workshop, hoping no one would notice his frivolous pursuits. He had become someone who understood that art was not separate from life but central to it, not a luxury for those who had solved all their practical problems, but a necessity for anyone who wanted to truly live rather than merely exist. The final moment of recognition came during the Institute's closing ceremony. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy had gathered to sign what was being called the Aesthetic Accord, the first interspecies agreement to formally acknowledge the importance of beauty, creativity, and artistic expression in galactic civilization. As Princess Zarathul prepared to add her signature to the document, she turned to address the assembly. "This accord represents more than an agreement between governments," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "It represents a recognition that intelligence without beauty is incomplete, that civilization without art is merely sophisticated barbarism, and that the impulse to create something meaningful is perhaps the most important thing that unites all conscious beings." She paused, her wings creating patterns that were somehow both regal and deeply personal. "We have learned that strength comes in many forms, that there are kinds of power that cannot be measured in terms of military might or economic influence. We have learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not the conquest of new territories or the development of new technologies, but the simple creation of something beautiful for no reason other than that beauty itself has value." As she signed the accord, her wings displayed the same patterns Marcus had first seen in his workshop on Kepler Station. The dance of appreciation for purposeless beauty that had started this entire transformation. One by one, the other representatives added their signatures, each accompanied by their species' own form of aesthetic expression. The hall filled with colors, sounds, and movements that created an improvised symphony of interspecies celebration. Marcus watched from the side of the hall, no longer feeling like an outsider, but not quite comfortable being the center of attention either. He had never sought to become a galactic celebrity or cultural catalyst. He had simply wanted to create things that were beautiful, and somehow that simple desire had changed the course of civilization itself. As the ceremony concluded and beings began to disperse, Princess Zarathul approached him one final time. "What will you do now?" she asked. "The Institute would be honored to have you as a permanent director. There are offers from dozens of worlds for you to establish cultural exchange programs. You could spend the rest of your life as the galaxy's foremost expert on interspecies aesthetic communication." Marcus considered the offers, all of which represented opportunities he could never have imagined when he first started carving ornaments from salvaged materials. But as he thought about what he truly wanted, the answer was surprisingly clear. "I think I'd like to go back to Kepler Station," he said. "Back to my workshop. There are still broken things that need to be turned into beautiful things, and I suspect there always will be." Princess Zarathul's wings shifted into patterns of understanding and approval. "Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all," she said, "that the greatest revolutions begin not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with the simple decision to create something beautiful in the midst of an indifferent universe." As Marcus prepared to return to the station that had been his home for so many years, he carried with him the knowledge that his ridiculed ornaments had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had proven that art was not a luxury or a weakness, but a fundamental force for connection and understanding between beings who might otherwise have remained forever alien to each other. The maintenance worker who had once hidden his hobby from disapproving neighbors had become living proof that sometimes the smallest acts of creation can have the largest consequences. And in workshops and studios across the galaxy, beings who had never before dared to make something beautiful for its own sake were picking up tools and materials, ready to continue the revolution that had begun, with a few humble ornaments and a human who refused to believe that beauty was meaningless. The Dragon Princess had been right about one thing. The most important changes in the universe often begin with someone deciding that something ridiculed and dismissed might actually be precious beyond measure. Marcus Chen had made that decision, and in doing so, he had helped an entire galaxy remember what it meant to be truly alive.